I'm often reminded how life is messy. And sometimes it's messy, just not really that big a deal. There's not too much hullabaloo or anything. But in general, we just have messes. The other day, I was in my kitchen and I knocked over a glass of water, a cup of water. And water got on the table, on the chair, on the floor. And so I cleaned it up. Now, it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, water is pretty easy to clean up. So wipe it off, and then eventually the rest of it evaporates and everything. But sometimes life has messes that are really easy to clean up, and sometimes not. But that was just an example that came to mind of one that's really not that big of a deal. But we all find messes in our lives. We all find difficulties of things that we have to clean up. But as I think about this concept of mess, I'm reminded that sin causes messes that only God can clean. And I think we have to make sure we don't forget about that second part. And we look at the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, we see instances where messes happen. And sometimes they start off simple, sometimes they seem harmless at the time, but this mess can continue to snowball if we don't take care of it. And the book of Judges shows us one mess after another. And we come to Judges chapter 3, verse 12, starting in verse 12, and we find what is the second cycle in the Judges' history, the Judges' story. We have cycle after cycle after cycle, and this is the second cycle. So we pick up the story in Judges chapter 3, verse 12. It says, "Once again, Israel did evil in the Lord's sight, and the Lord gave King Eglon of Moab control over Israel because of their evil. Eglon enlisted the Ammonites and Amalekites as allies, and he went out and defeated Israel, taking possession of Jericho, the city of palms. And the Israelites served Eglon of Moab for 18 years. Again, this is the second cycle. We just finished with Othniel and his cycle, and that they had peace in the land, and then he died. And then the next verse is that we find Israel did evil in the Lord's sight. Now, most cycles have their typical things that are involved, and one of the things that's usually involved is that God gave Israel over to the enemy, whoever that may be in that particular cycle. But in this cycle, we see that God raised up the enemy. He gave Eglon, king of Moab, power, authority, and he defeated Israel. So on some level, maybe we're talking about semantics, but we see God didn't just give Israel over to the enemy. He raised up the enemy. He gave the enemy power. And this name Eglon is not I've never heard the word Eglon outside of this particular passage, but it can be translated to be young calf or bull. And we'll find that he was, the text is pretty straightforward. The text says that he was fat. We'll get to that point. So we see that there's this imagery of he's the fattened calf getting ready to be sacrificed for slaughter. We find the Old Testament has the practices of making sacrifices to God, and the fattened calf was a common one that they would sacrifice. And so what we see happening here is, even though we don't necessarily see it or understand it, God is on the move. He is putting pieces together for his purposes. And what I'm getting at is he is getting the enemies of Israel together. Moab, Ammon, and Amalek are all coming together, and God's putting them together so Israel can then take care of them. But before we get to that point, I think it's important to recognize that there's some family history that's involved here, that all these groups of people are connected. You may remember that Israel is the son of Abraham, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob his name is changed to Israel. That's where we get Israel. Well, Moab and Ammon were also connected. Remember when Abraham went to Canaan and God called him there, he took with him his nephew Lot. And Lot lived in this wonderful little place called Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, God destroyed that, but through various events, Lot was able to escape. God spared Lot. So Lot and his wife and his two daughters fled the city, but his wife didn't make it. So it was Lot and his two daughters. Well, his daughters were concerned that their father's lineage would stop. And so they concocted a plan where they got their father drunk and had him impregnate them. And so we find that Moab is the son of Lot and his older daughter, and Ammon, which is the Ammonites, is the son of Lot and his younger daughter. And so we see they're connected to Israel, and we see that bad things are already happening in that lineage's line because of how it started. But then we get to Amalek. Amalek is the grandson of Esau, which means he is the great-great-grandson of Abraham. Now, all I'm trying to get to the point is that there is some family lineage, some ancestral connections between Israel and all these people. Sometimes I think we get caught up, well, we're kind of connected, so that's okay. From a faith perspective, we can say we're kind of connected to Jesus, so that's good. Well, no. We got to be fully committed, fully connected, fully engaged in who Jesus is. Otherwise, we're going to start going in the wrong direction. So Moab enlisted the allies of the Ammonites and Amalekites. And again, God's working behind the scenes. He's gathering the enemies of Israel together to be able to deal with. Israel's in a mess. They have sinned. They've done evil in the Lord's sight. They're a mess. They've done bad things. But God is working behind the scenes to clean up this mess. And they were oppressed for 18 years, which is a long time. It's way longer than the first cycle, which was only 8 years. But it took them 18 years to have this spiritual insight to say, God, we need something. We need to do something. They were trying to figure out all this on their own for 18 years, but finally they couldn't. Israel was getting worse, and they realized they had to make a change. And so in verse 15, we find that they cry out to the Lord. But we have this concept of mess. And water, as I said, is something that's pretty easy to clean up. Get a towel, you move on. It's kind of, that's it. Maybe this doesn't happen at your house, but every once in a while at my house, I have some people, not to mention any names, who maybe they eat a cracker and don't eat it over the plate as much as they could have. And so crumbs fall on the floor. Maybe I'm sure that happens nowhere else, right? But I hate crumbs with a passion. When they get on the floor, if you step on it with your foot, like you step on a Cheerio and you hear the crunch, you're like, oh, that just bothers me. But if you walk on it with bare feet, I just find that kind of gross and grungy. And but I recognize crumbs are pretty easy to clean up. You get a broom, you clean it up, it's not a big deal. It doesn't take much effort. It probably can take you about 30 seconds to clean up a significant area, and then you move on with life. But if you don't clean it up, you attract bugs, you attract things that you don't want. It's kind of gross. But God's people, we need to make sure we recognize the messes in our life. And when we do, we have to do what Israel did, and they cried out to the Lord for help. And we find that in verse 15. And the Lord again raised up a rescuer to save them. His name was Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed man of the tribe of Benjamin. The Israelites sent Ehud to deliver the tribute money to King Eglon of Moab. So Ehud made a double-edged dagger that was about a foot long, and he strapped it to his right thigh, keeping it hidden under his clothing. He brought the tribute money to Eglon, who was very fat. And after delivering the payment, Ehud started home with those who had helped carry the tribute. So I said we need to act like Israel and cry out to the Lord. We probably need to take it, we need to take it a step further, because what's happening, Israel is crying out to the Lord. They're not repenting. They're not saying we're sorry we did it. They're saying we're sorry we got caught. We're sorry the consequences. So they're just saying, God, it's a mess. We've tried it ourselves. We need you to intervene. We need you to save us. And in this context, we find that Ehud is bringing tribute to Moab. Now, Ehud is from the tribe of Benjamin. Israel had 12 sons, and for all intents and purposes, the 12 sons formed the 12 tribes of Israel. And Benjamin was one of the 12 sons. And so we see Benjamin is making an appearance in this scene. Now, Benjamin had a kind of a prominent history throughout the course of Israel. It was the tribe that was almost wiped out. In the end of the book of Judges, we find that bad things happen and choices are made, and they almost end up getting wiped out. But another thing we see throughout Israel's history is there is kind of a battle between the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Judah. So Ehud is the second judge, and he is from the tribe of Benjamin. Othniel was the first judge. We talked about him last week, and he is from the tribe of Judah. Othniel is the prime judge, the one that everybody looks up to. He's the judge in which all judges are judged against. Ehud had some flaws, had some issues, wasn't necessarily perfect. You may remember that Saul, who was the first king of Israel, was from the tribe of Benjamin. Things didn't work out for Saul very well, made some bad choices, particularly end of life. And then we see David, who's from the tribe of Judah, is the second king, and David is highly revered. So we see this battle between Benjamin and between Judah. But the text I read from was a New Living Translation, and it says that Ehud was a left-handed man. Now, there's some tongue-in-cheek going on here, because the name Benjamin actually means from the right hand. And so we see that a left-handed man is from the right hand, which is kind of a weird play on words with that. But the text is actually pretty ambiguous. The translation I read, again, said he was a left-handed man, but that's not really what it's saying. It said he was bound in his right hand. That's what it's literally saying. So there are a few options for what we could identify this to actually mean. One, he could have just been left-handed. Right? That is a clear, obvious example. He could have been left-handed, which would have just been ironic because of the tribe. Now, at the same time, the tribe of Benjamin had an elite group of warriors who trained themselves to be left-handed. They use a sling to give them advantage in battle by being left-handed. And so what they would do is they would bind their right hand somehow and force them to gain strength in their left hand, which would some reason give them an advantage on the battlefield. So we could find that Ehud is left-handed. We could find that he's ambidextrous, that maybe he bound his right hand so his left hand could get more strength, or that he's just able to use both hands exceptionally well. Another option is that he was handicapped, that there was some type of deformity with his right hand that prevented him from being able to use it as well as a normal individual could. Now, that might be a little strange, because why would Israel send a handicapped individual to escort this large sum of money? Right? They wanted to make sure they sent the best of the best to protect it, so they got to Moab. They didn't want to take a chance to make sure that the tribute would not actually get there. But the real important part of the story is not which option it is, but the fact that Ehud could use his left hand well. He was strong in his left hand. He's able to use it as though it was his strong hand. But in this context, we see that Israel's being oppressed. They have made bad choices. They've done evil in the sight of the Lord, and now they are paying tribute to Moab, which makes Moab stronger and makes Israel weaker, which is the purpose, which is what is happening. But there's also some religious undertones happening here, because when we talk about presenting tribute, there might be some religious ritual involved with it, that the ruling nation would force the other nation to follow their religious practices in order to make some sacrifices or something to appease them in this process. And so in general, Israel's at the mercy of Moab and what they were allowed or not allowed to do, which shows that there is a mess. Another mess that comes to mind, though, is if you have this nice full plate of spaghetti, got these nice noodles on your plate, all the sauce and meat on it, and everything falls off the plate. You don't drop the plate itself, but everything slips off the plate onto the floor. Man, that just bothers me. That's gross. First off, it wastes food, right? Nobody wins with that. It wastes food. But there's no good way to clean up a big mess of spaghetti on the floor, right? You've got to get your hands dirty. It's not like you can get the broom and clean it up that way. The only thing I could really think of is if you've got a wet, dry shop vac, that's to just suck it up that way. But any other way, you've got to touch the stuff. You got to get your hands in there to pick it up and throw it in the trash can. Because there's unless you use about 27 rolls of paper towels, you're going to get stuff on your hands. And then after you get all the noodles and sauce up, then you've got to actually put some cleaner down to clean it up. And so it's a mess. It's not easy to clean, and it's it's kind of gross on some levels. So I don't have a texture issue or anything, but at some levels, it's just not fun to clean those types of things up. We have different messes in our life, which Israel finds himself in. After they give tribute, Ehud has some actions that he does in verse 19. It says, when he reached the stone idols near Gilgal, he turned back. He came to Eglon and said, I have a secret message for you. So the king commanded his servants, be quiet. And he sent them all out of the room. Ehud walked over to Eglon, who was sitting alone in a cool upstairs room. Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. As King Eglon rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand and pulled the dagger strapped to his right thigh and plunged it into the king's belly. The dagger went so deep that the handle disappeared beneath the king's fat. So Ehud did not pull the dagger from the king's bowels, and the bowel was emptied. Then Ehud closed and locked the door of the room and escaped down the latrine. After Ehud was gone, the king's servants returned and found the doors to the upstairs room locked. They thought he might be using the latrine in the room, so they waited. But when the king didn't come out after a long delay, they became concerned and got a key. And when they opened the doors, they found our master dead on the floor. If you know anything, if you've heard this story before, you know it's not one we talk about much in the church. Because this isn't a typical type story that we read and say, praise the Lord. Because it's messy. And that's what happens with sin. And the point of the story is not to give us freedom to be assassins. That's not what's happening here. But it shows that sin is messy. It causes real, difficult problems. And if we don't acknowledge that, we can just brush over those problems and act like nothing is wrong and continue to living in the mess that we have created. But there is a mess that is happening in Israel with God's people, and this is how it's being dealt with. In order to deal with it, Ehud creates a scenario where he can have a private meeting with the king. And on some level, he is speaking to the ego of Eglon. So I've got a secret message just for you. And Eglon hears that. It makes him feel pretty good. It piques his interest. And so he clears the room and gets everybody out so he can have this message presented to him. But there's a subtle detail in the story that is intriguing. It's when Ehud gets to the stone idols that he turns around and goes back to Eglon. And so what's happening here is the author is writing this story in a way that shows that Ehud is leading Israel away from the idolatry of these other nations, is leading Israel away from their sinful actions so that they can go and serve the one true God that is Yahweh. He is leaving that sinful life behind and going towards God. That is the turning point of the story. Because no matter what happened, once Ehud left that idolatrous way, once he left those idols and went towards God, God was going to work everything out. Sometimes I think we forget our biggest step is not the actions that are required to overcome, but to recognize that we need to leave our past. That we need to leave our mess. We need to leave these actions of sin and follow God, and then God will take care of all the other details. And in that moment, Eglon cleared the room. And this, on some level, we have to say that the king, Eglon, trusted his guards, trusted his security team, that it was a safe environment. And so really what's at stake here is the reason the left-handed nature is brought up is that someone who is right-handed would keep their sword on their left side, and so you draw your sword that way. There's no good way to have your sword on your right side and draw it without hurting yourself or just being real awkward about it. So if you ever are at a wedding and you wonder which side you're supposed to sit on, the groom is supposed to have his right hand available for the sword, so in case anybody tries to come and steal his bride. So that's really the history behind it. I don't know if that's true or the myth, but that's the point of the guards. The implication here is that the guards would have checked the left side of Ehud to make sure that there was nothing there. But Ehud was left-handed, so he's able to keep the dagger on his right side to be able to conceal it and give him a weapon when he had the time alone with the king. Now, as I said, this story is a bit of a mess. And really, a lot of our English translations are pretty polite with how it talks about what happens here. Particularly the NIV is really polite about it. But really, it's that the dirt came out or the bowels were spilled. And to the point where smell began to waft into the area. Like, this is not a clean-cut story. And it shows the mess that sin creates. But because of that, it gave Ehud the opportunity to escape. Now, he escaped down the latrine. That probably was not plan A. That probably was not what he wanted to do. He's like, you know what? This is going to be awesome, right? It may have been off in a story later. But, desperate times call for desperate measures. But we see this is how God was able to clean up the mess that sin had caused. And we have messes in our own life. Now, as I think about this story, every time I mow, I go through my yard, I have a dog, and I clean up the yard before I mow. Now, I don't do that every single day. Usually only before I mow. And so every once in a while, we have someone that puts their foot in a place that they wish they wouldn't have put it. But usually, and we don't know that until we come back into the house. And we start saying, there's a bit of a smell that we don't like in here. And then we see, there's some marks on the floor that we've got to clean up, right? And everyone's been there. You know somebody who has. So you understand what's happening with that. And cleaning up the floor is usually not that big of a deal. But man, getting that stuff off your shoes, that's a nightmare, right? First off, it's not fun. If you found a good way to do that, please let me know. But it's not fun, and honestly, it takes a long time for me to be confident that the shoe was fully clean, right? But we recognize that it's a process. Sometimes cleaning up the mess takes a while. It takes time. It takes energy. But we've got to deal with it. We can't just pretend it doesn't exist. We can't just hope it will go away. We've got to deal with it, which is what Ehud was doing. Because while the servants were waiting, Ehud escaped, passing the stone idols on his way to Sarah. When he arrived in the hill country of Ephraim, Ehud sounded a call to arms. Then he led a band of Israelites down from Moab. "Follow me," he said, "for the Lord has given you victory over Moab, your enemy." So they followed him, and the Israelites took control of the shallow crossings of the Jordan River across from Moab, preventing anyone from crossing. They attacked the Moabites and killed 10,000 of their strongest and most able-bodied warriors. Not one of them escaped. So Moab was conquered by Israel that day, and there was peace in the land for 80 years. So the servants were in a really awkward position. And partially, at that time, serving a king was a bit of a precarious spot to be in because there was no accountability. If the king got mad at you, the king could do whatever they wanted, right? You could be fired, you could be executed, you could be all sorts of things, right? The king had no accountability with any of this. And so the servants wanted to make sure they cared for the king, but they didn't want to bother the king. So they let Eglon be there by himself for a long time, which gave Ehud the opportunity to escape. And so after that, Ehud raised up an army. This was the perfect time to attack because the head of the snake was cut off. I mean, that makes sense. We see the tactical advantage that was happening in this moment because Moab would have been fairly confused. Oh, what's going on? Eglon died? What's the next step? Who's in control now? How does all this happen? Which also is compounded by the fact that their allies, the Ammonites and Amalekites, might not have wanted to take any risk if there was uncertainty. ooh, do we really want to engage in this? And so uncertainty is permeating throughout the entire group. But Moab is still in power. Israel is still oppressed. So the problem has not been solved. So Ehud raises up an army and they attack. But as we read the book of Judges, we find that Israel gets worse and worse and worse. That we start with Othniel, the ideal judge, and everything gets a little bit worse after every cycle. And the people's spiritual health gets a little bit less after every cycle. And so this may be subtle, but I think it shows the downward spiral. That with Othniel, there was a problem. God raised up a judge. He went to battle, went to war, and solved the problem. And there's an implication that everyone's behind Othniel. Well, with Ehud, we find that Ehud has to go through a lot of hoops, has to take care of Eglon before he can rally the troops. Before he can get people together to go and fight this battle, he has to do a bunch of things. And so finally, the people of Israel are ready. They come and they join Ehud in his efforts to save Israel. But I love what he says in verse 28. Ehud says, "Follow me, for the Lord has given victory over Moab, your enemy." He has given you victory, which I think is really important for us to make sure we claim in our own lives. God has given you victory. Not because of anything I've done, but because of who He is. God has given you victory. So Ehud is claiming to Israel that God has given them victory. And Ehud's actions were not the victory in and of itself. His actions were to inspire others so that they could come and participate in this victory. God had already raised up Ehud. The victory had already been given. Israel just had not received it yet. So I say to you, you have victory in your life, whether you have received it or not. But if you have not received it, God says, I want to give it to you right now. But we have these messes. We have these messes in our lives that we do all we can to clean. We do all we can to take care of on our own. So the last mess that comes to mind is if you break something like a piece of glass on the kitchen floor. You know, the first thing you do when you break something like glass is you make sure everybody around there has shoes on. That's the first thing you do. Actually, the first thing you do is you just freeze and you panic. I do at least. And then you sweep it up. And you sweep it up. And you sweep it up. And you go over it again and again and again and again. Because you want to make sure you get every last piece of glass. Because even that real small piece of glass can cut your foot. Can cause a lot of pain and discomfort. But every time I've tried my best to clean up the glass, every time I'll find at least one more piece the next day or the next week. I'll keep finding pieces no matter my best effort. And so what I realize is that we put forth a lot of effort. We are trying to clean up the mess ourselves. We're cleaning and sweeping and wiping and scrubbing. But we can't get it all. I don't care who you are. Sin has caused a mess in your life that only God can clean. And I'll tell you what, I think one of the messes that we have to make sure we guard against is that of pride. Because we can think of, oh, well, this person's got a mess over there, or this person's got a mess over there, and we miss the messes in our own life. And so what happens is we miss out on the victory that God is giving us. God gave Israel victory, and for 80 years, they had peace. Now, this is the longest period of peace that Israel had. And 40 years is kind of a Hebrew idiom for a generation. So it's for 2 generations they had peace. I want to say to you, God wants to give you peace. He wants to clean the mess in your own life. Even if it's something as simple as water that can just be wiped up with a towel. Or something as dangerous as glass that can cut and harm. And we can't get every last piece ourselves. We all have messes. But it's only by coming to Jesus, only by coming to Him, can we actually be clean of these messes. No matter your best efforts, you cannot do it yourself. You can do a lot of the work, but you will never be fully clean until you come to Jesus and allow Him to clean you. So wherever you are today, I want to challenge you to make sure you recognize your life. Because Jesus doesn't ask you to have it all put together before you come to Him. He just says, come as you are. Whatever you're going through, wherever you think you are, wherever you think you're not, Jesus says, just come to me. He says, I will give you rest. I will clean you. I will make you whole.